Greetings and salutations. This is Abe Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. As always, you can become a bitter pill for a mere $2 a month and get 5 fresh bumper stickers with the show's badass logo. Everyone wants one of those, I think, right? And support the show. So again, patreon.com/The Bitter Truth. You become a bitter pill. We're going to be releasing some more tiers toward the end of the year, beginning of the year, but right now we can be a bitter pill. Today, I'm blessed to have a guest on the show, friend of the show, Chris Ward, who is works with Ward of the World. He's also worked with Vets for Peace. He's a military veteran in the Army, has been involved in several different campaigns, and we're going to just jump into it and talk about some current issues and how they kind of bleed into the bigger picture. Chris, are you there?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, Abe.
Hey, man, the last couple times you've been on were great, and I got some really good feedback. So, and it's just always great to have a chat with you anyway, man. So, so really quick, I know you work with Ward of the World. Talk about that a little bit before we get into some of the stuff we talked about earlier today.
Okay. Well, essentially, Ward of the World is more of a concept. It's an idea that I had, and just because. I think, as I had mentioned to you, because my last name is Ward, but I always like the idea, Ward of the World essentially is each and every one of us as a brand in which we highlight people that are able to impact their own community, their state, their country, and become essentially stewards of humanity. And I think that there are a lot of campaigns right now that we see that seek to diminish the civil rights and civil liberties of, in particular, minorities, and even as broad stroke as women, which aren't a minority at all. And I think that if we all take on a little bit and just say, what is it that I can do today to better the life of at least one other person? And that's what, as I explained to you, the name Ward is an Old English name, which means guardian or protector. Uh-huh. And so if each of us could be a ward of the world, that just means our own little world. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be Gandhi, but that you're going to, you're going to be, what is it that I can do to impact my world that I live in?
Right. Okay. Well, that sounds great, man. Well, I mean, how long have you been at the, How long have you been at this? I know it's kind of a brand / I mean, I don't know if you're going to try to make this into a foundation. What are some of the long-term goals with it?
The long-term goal is we're going to develop a city in Colorado. So we're calling it Canvas Colorado, meaning that it's a blank canvas that the city is designed by its inhabitants. And so it's a population of about 20,000 individuals down in central southern Colorado that we hope to break ground on here in a couple of years. And it's just going to be what we all believe as Tomorrowland, is the city of the future, a resource-based economy, a practice that we've seen in a couple of cities right now. There's a city in India called Oroville. It's 40 years old. And that idea, the concept is probably thousands of years old that I want to bring to the 21st.
Awesome, man. Well, that's great. Well, hey, let's jump into the present. Recently, and I don't want to, belabor the point too much because the news is finally, I shouldn't say finally, they've been covering it, I guess, pretty well, but I don't watch a lot of mainstream media, so that's probably my fault. But Jamal Khashoggi was taken in at a Turkish, at the Saudi Arabian Turkish consulate. He went in a couple of days earlier. They said, hey, your thing's not ready till 2 days from now. He walks in to get his little permit to marry his Turkish fiancée, doesn't come out. In the interim, a couple of chartered planes showed up with 15 Saudi agents, and he's never seen. And the Saudis are like, nah, we don't know where he is. And you're like, okay, well, he's not showing up. He's not popping up. He didn't come back outside to get a cell phone from his fiancée. So the Saudis effectively killed a Washington Post reporter because they didn't like him. So we've had a tenuous relationship with these guys for a very long time. And now I'm thinking it's probably maybe this guy's the Franz Ferdinand of the Middle East. Who knows? I mean, he might start a bigger fracas. But what are your thoughts? What do you know? I heard one guy on a website being interviewed by The Real News, And he said that the Turks actually had footage because he had his Apple Watch turned on, and it went to his phone. And supposedly they got footage of him being murdered. But I don't know if what you've heard and what some of your thoughts are on this.
So, from what I've gathered thus far, that they had about 15 Saudi nationals that were already inside the consulate waiting because Jamal had an appointment there to fill out some documents at the consulate in Istanbul. And so he was killed, and it was actually a Turkish employee inside the consulate stated that they'd use a bone saw and dismember the body for disposal on that day. And so, yeah, I would go without, and it's not something that, we've seen authoritarian governments kill off journalists for decades.
Sure.
Ones that undermined the Saudi royal family. However, it's never been as overt as we had seen in this situation, because we could track the goon squad from chartered planes landing at the airport, watching them enter into the consulate. And like you said, he walked in and he didn't walk out. What happened to the body?
Right.
So,
and
it's pretty troubling. It's pretty troubling that the crown prince his arrogance is beyond measure, but to think that these kind of criminal acts, and it's not on foreign soil, it's on Saudi soil. That's, sadly that's how consulates work.
No, I get that. And then I was actually kind of surprised of the reaction of some Republicans, because especially the last couple 3 years, it's been Russia, 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 and now they're saber rattling Iran and Venezuela. I want to get in that in here in a little bit, but we never really say anything. We support their genocide in Yemen. We don't say anything about that. They chop off more heads than ISIS in a week, every week, and we don't say anything about that. And then we make one of those princes the head of the UN Commission on Human Rights or whatever. What are your thoughts on some of the Republicans that are kind of speaking out on this and actually saying some pretty brutal things, which I was actually kind of like Lindsey Graham, who's just loves Israel, loves the Saudis, never says a bad thing of it. He was pretty pissed. I was actually kind of surprised at some of the Republicans' reactions.
No, absolutely, and as they are politicians as well, I think. It was somebody that I heard a reporter. I just get a lot of my news. If I want to find probably the most authentic, unbiased news, I go to Al Jazeera myself.
Yeah.
And I heard a reporter said that Trump said, and I quote, that what happened with Jamal Khashoggi was a bad thing. and the reporter said that's probably as negative as we've heard him speak on the subject, and I thought that was funny. That I was like, yeah, that's a bad thing. It's horrible what they did. So
unfortunate. It was unfortunate.
No, absolutely, and I think that when I listen to politicians, they can damn with their mouth, but what are they doing with their signatures?
Right.
And when I see them pass legislation and they allow, back in you'll remember back, I think it was in April, when they went to Saudi Arabia and they said, listen, we want to minimize, because it's U.S. bombs being dropped in Yemen.
Yes.
We've known time after time after time. They've even shown pictures of shrapnel with, from some of the top defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, so on and so forth. Obviously, their weapon systems. So they went over there back, I think it was in April, and said, listen, what can we do to minimize civilian casualties? Because, we're getting a really bad rap here. And so it was funny is that, of course, the Saudi crown prince was like, oh, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that it's only combatants that end up in the, in the kill zone. And before he gets up and leaves the room, they launched in one of the most barbaric bombing campaigns right after that. It's kind of like whatever they can say in front of the camera and put in the news. Well, I could damn the killing of this reporter all day long.
Sure.
But when legislation comes to my desk, R or D, it doesn't matter. What actions am I going to take? Am I going to, and that's just politicians. And they're beholden to these defense contractors.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, last March of 17, when Trump approved his first $100 billion deal, in 2016 on my birthday, Barack Obama approved a $100 billion deal for the Saudis. And this is at the time when the Saudis were lavishing the Clinton Foundation with a ton of money. So this was not an accident. March of last year, Ivanka Trump had received a $100 million donation to her nonprofit from the Saudis after her dad's first $100 billion deal. And then earlier this spring, we did another one. And now this deal is on hold or they're talking about putting it on hold. And Trump's like, no, that's bad because the Chinese will sell them weapons and the Russians will sell them weapons. Well, when do we draw the line? I mean, you were there. You've been there. You were in the military there. How often does this shit go down? And for how many years has it been going down like this? Because those guys are just rife with human rights abuses. Like, we keep going on about Assad, bombing his own people. All of those reports have been debunked, gassing his own people. That shit's been debunked. But we ignore what Saudi Arabia does. How often does this kind of thing happen over there?
And where? I apologize.
I'm sorry, Saudi Arabia.
Oh, I myself have not been to Saudi Arabia, but the Saudi Arabia, I have to go back to when I really got agitated by it. Was prior to September 11th. We had received intelligence that elements within the highest reaches of the Saudi government were involved in a calculated plan to attack the United States.
Sure.
And this was prior to September 11, 2001. So there was an ongoing investigation between the NSA, the CIA, and the FBI. During the attack, that investigation, we followed Saudi royal family members, and part of the bin Laden family that were expedited out of the country back to Saudi Arabia when all other planes had been grounded. Following, we had seen more evidence of the collaboration between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and elements inside the United States government were involved in the attacks on 9/11. And yet, despite all this, whenever Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State, knowing at the point she was a member of it was a congressional committee on it was emerging threats and capabilities of foreign entities. Knowing fair well that this was an ongoing investigation, still granted at her time the largest weapons deal to Saudi Arabia. I think it was like $7 billion, and up to that point had not exceeded that. And it just sickened me. And that's kind of when the spotlight turned on Saudi Arabia. And you look at Osama bin Laden, and you look at his story, how he got involved in the Al-Qaeda, the financing of him and his, band of merry misfits as they progressed in the conflict against Russia, onward into the 90s for that conflict to turn against the United States, move the battlefield into Iraq, and then ultimately into supporting the people in Iran.
Well, see, and that's the thing.
It's sad that decades have gone by, and nobody has turned off the faucet for financing what I believe is a terrorist state in Saudi Arabia.
Well, see, and this is the thing. When you mentioned the bin Laden family members that got expedited out of here, that was like within 4 days of the 9/11 attacks. It was 41 of them to be specific, and they weren't even debriefed by CIA or FBI. They just got put on planes and split. And this is when all the planes were grounded, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, what is it about? I mean, obviously the oil, obviously the petrodollar. We made a deal with them in '73 with Kissinger and Nixon. But there's other players and we don't even get all our oil from there anymore. At this point, we're just basically guarding the world's oil supply. Why don't we hold these guys to task? I mean, it was Saudi Arabia and the Pakistanis that were involved with 9/11, but we invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, what is the fetish that we have with Saudi Arabia? I mean, we support 73% of the world's dictators. That's not a big secret, and they're one of them. But why can't we cut them loose? Or why don't we come up with some brilliant idea, like, I don't know, invading them and taking their oil? What keeps us from doing the kind of things that we are trying to do and have done to several countries in the Middle East, including Libya and Iraq?
I honestly have no earthly idea. There was one thing that when I was in Bosnia, there was a gentleman by the name of Hasan Cengic. Okay. And he was an Islamic fundamentalist, not quite an extremist, who owned I want to say it was an airplane parts manufacturing firm that during the Balkan War, he transitioned to creating weapons. And so largely supported by the Nation of Islam and supported, of course, the Bosniak Muslim faction of the three-way, war, what we know of as the Balkan War throughout the 90s. So whenever Hasan Cengic became essentially a war criminal, I don't know if he was ever actually indicted, but the last I found, he was living high on the hog over in Vienna, Austria, never to see a day in court. And from my research working in intelligence, largely supported by the United States for international weapons deals. And we look at other prominent international weapons dealers, even in Russia, where you don't have to go very far. I think Lord of War was the Nicolas Cage film, right, highlighted that, where essentially you can move about committing basically acts of crime against humanity. And as long as you're serving U.S. interests, even if you are financing and arming our enemies, killing our own U.S. troops, as long as you're also serving U.S. interests, we've got your back.
Well, that's not a secret, though, is it? I mean, we've known about that for a long time. I mean, the average listener who periodically watches the news or maybe reads something online that's like news-ish or political twice a month, even. I mean, even they know that, right?
Well, you would think so, but the challenge is that, especially in the last, I would say, the presidential election, so 2015 leading into the current administration, is you've seen this rise in nationalism.
Sure.
Where the ends justify the means at all costs. We've built up this sense of nationalism. We've emboldened those who seek that America is the number one country on the planet. Everybody else could die as far as we care. We're not going to let anybody else into this country because everybody's a terrorist, or at least everybody's a potential terrorist. So it doesn't matter, if you come from a country with brown people, there's very good likelihood that you're a terrorist, and we are not going to allow you on U.S. soil. And this idea is permeated, and we've seen a lot in the news. So, where if an undocumented, Mexican, I'm just going to throw that out there, kills somebody,
right,
they're going to be like, oh my God, this was an undocumented person killing. She would have been, or he would have been alive today if it wasn't for these lax immigration policies that just allow everybody la-di-da-di to walk into our country, right, which is completely not true. We've got one of the stiffest immigration policies in the industrialized world. And yet, right here in Colorado, a father killed his wife and 2 kids, and it barely was a blip on the national radar.
Right, because he was a white guy, right?
He belonged here. So who cares if he killed people? And it's funny, the photographs, the difference between the two in the news, where all the photographs of he and his family are like their Christmas photos, and they're all smiles and happy, and this and that, like, distraught father, decides to take the life of his loving wife and children, where the international terrorist is snuck in from Mexico, kills unsuspecting girl. Like, even the news, mainstream media, creates that fear base of the American people only to solidify our sense of xenophobia and nationalism.
Well, well, listen, it's the reason why you watch Al Jazeera and RT or whatever, because you don't, BBC's bought, NPR is corporate. NPR sounds like MSNBC now. They're a little more they're a little more tame, but I mean, shit. A couple of months back when they were covering Nicaragua, they were making it sound like Daniel Ortega was, he'd become the new boss or whatever, and you're sort of like, well, read between the lines. He's trying to protect a government, and he, by the way, was democratically elected. But I mean, so and you dropped out a second ago when I asked you the guy in Denver. He was a white guy, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So that's just to get clarity on that. Yeah. It blip on the radar because he's a white guy. But see, and this is the thing. And I want to kind of get into this now too. Because we'll sit there and we can vilify somebody just like that. I mean, before the first Gulf War, Iraq was our ally for like 10, 12 years. They fought Iran for us, even though we kind of fucked them by selling Iran weapons behind their back so we could fund the Contras in Nicaragua. So all of this to say that within 2 months, they were the Hitler of the desert, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we justified going into, or not going into, but bombing Iraq to get them out of Kuwait. Excuse me. Now, with Iran, we're doing the same damn thing. And we've been doing it since the 70s when they knocked out the Shah and, took over the country and nationalized their oil again, which, they tried to do before. The Shah's dad, Shah I, in the 20s and 30s, tried to do that and beat the British and the Russians, knocked him out, installed the son. So I'm sure Thanksgiving was not too awkward. And then, who we know to be the Shah, that guy, then he was kicked out. Then they had Mohammad Mossadegh come in, win a democratically held election. And then they booted him with the CIA and Kermit Roosevelt. And then he's under house arrest for several years. And basically for the crime of running for president, And so, but now, and then he was a brutal dictator for 26, 27 years. And then when the Muslims kicked him out and started nationalizing their own oil, and people could argue back and forth, well, Iran sponsors terror, blah, blah, blah. I mean, what the fuck does Israel do? What if, look at Saudi Arabia. How much terror does Iran sponsor compared to, say, Israel, who actually tests all their weapons that they used or that they sell to law enforcement agencies all over the world? They test them on the Gaza Strip. They sell 60% of the world's drones. They test them on Palestinians in Gaza. So I think that's kind of terror, if you ask me. So where do we get this baked in the brain bullshit where we look one way? You can't just have some democracy, right? You can't just have some human rights. And so now we're vilifying Iran and saber rattling to go into Iran, which will not be Iraq. If you think we got our asses kicked on Iraq, Iran's going to be a lot of fun. So where does this all come from? I mean, where does this all come from in terms of, I know this is a rhetorical question, but you're the expert. I want you to answer this. Where does this come from that we have this baked in the brain where we could just shift our rudder on at the drop of a dime based on what the corporate-owned media tell us to do?
You're asking the $1 million question about that, because when it's amazing, you almost have to believe in. If you will remember the Podesta emails that arose that were hacked by the Democratic National Committee during 2000, I think it was 15 and 16.
Yep.
And they had talked about a shadow government where there's international corporations and governments, which it's almost, the words that are almost interchangeable now. And without even knowing, it's like you cannot put your finger on who is or what is responsible because there's so many players at hand. So when you look at, like you said, in 1980, I think one of my favorite photographs was of Donald Rumsfeld with the shitting grin on his hand, shaking hands with Saddam Hussein.
Right.
And like you said, you could go through case after case after case where the United States had supported Iraq. I mean, Saddam Hussein was our man in the Middle East.
Yeah, he was.
We helped to put him into power. We supported him, 20 times over. But it is, as you mentioned, is that because Iran does not want to play ball, they're constantly, as soon as we can overthrow Assad and put some sort of a U.S. puppet in there to do our bidding, we're going to see this rise in conflict. And of course, we always try the media, like you had mentioned. The media is going to tell us fabricated stories, and we fed the media. When I was in intelligence, we fed the media stories that we wanted them to run to influence public opinion. It's not, people act like that's some new concept. They're like, oh, no, I saw it on the news. If I hear one more person use the news as a frame of reference for where they're getting their information, I'm like, I would get fired. So we call it open source intelligence, OSINT, and it's the least, it's probably the least viable form of intelligence gathering, and that's what you get through Open Media Challenge, and now in the advent of social media that we get from there as well. And so it's amazing the people that will support what the U.S. does tooth or nail because of the way the media portrays our involvement in overseas activities. And I agree with what you said. A conflict. First of all, the war with Iran. I may be shooting myself in the foot. I would guarantee anything. The United States will never go into a conflict with Iran because Iran, but I think by recent means, is anywhere between the 10th and 15th most powerful military force on the planet. They have one of the most effective intelligence organizations on the planet. Some of the best fighter pilots in the world are in Iran. I've trained, with a few of former Iranian special forces in combat arms. You think that Afghanistan was tough? You want to see a bloody onslaught? You go to war with Iran. You will lose troops it will make the entire, our almost 20 years in Afghanistan seem like nothing.
Wow.
It'll look like a car accident next to what will happen if we go to war with Iran.
Well, I've been saying that for years because people have been saber rattling these guys off and on for a while, and I'm like, this ain't Iraq, dude. Iran's not Iraq. I know they both start with an I and they're 4 letters, but they're not the same country. Not even a fucking long shot. And Iran is more sophisticated. They got a more sophisticated infrastructure. They actually have an economy. I know a ton of Iranians, as do you. And especially the ones that are in the States, they had their issues with the current government, but they will tell you flat out that the Shah was a fucking dictator, and that's why he had to go. Did they replace it with a better form of government? Probably not. They're killing and or harassing and torturing the other guy. So that's no good. But as the last 20 years, 15 years have evolved, they have become more civil to their society. So it's not as bad as it was in the 70s and 80s, early 90s when they first took over. That being said, for us to have this moral high ground, which I say sarcastically, well, they were attacking their own people, or whatever the fuck they're doing. I mean, what the hell are we doing? What are we doing? Assad gouged his people. We got to do something about that. We've been bombing them since 2011. I mean, where do we get off telling the world how to behave ethically as though we're some shining light on the hill? To quote Ronald Reagan, we're not. We haven't lived up to the founding documents like ever. We don't still. I mean,
never have.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you're exactly right. The biggest argument to overthrow Saddam Hussein was the fact that he killed 25,000 of his own countrymen who were nonconformists. And we have since killed millions of Iraqi civilians.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the number is well over 2 million Iraqi civilians.
Oh, yeah.
And so if you want to compare who is the human rights violator in that scenario, where are we making, when we moved into Bosnia in 1990, it was November of 97, and the war came to a screeching halt. We had one mission that was it was twofold. One is to gain and maintain stability in the region. The war came to a screeching halt the next day. I mean, we honestly took away all the weapons from all the different religious groups the Serbs, the Muslims, and the Croatians. I saw their police units walking around with sticks, training with branches. It was kind of embarrassing for them, how demasculating it was to watch them walk around in full uniform but carrying sticks.
Wow.
And, we did what we called active harvest. We walked, and this was a collaborative effort of all NATO nations. I walked with Polish, Turkish, Russian troops down the streets, going door to door, knocking on doors and collecting weapons. We collect automatic weapons, we collect landmines, RPGs, the rifle-propelled grenades, the whole 9 yards. And I felt like we were honestly making life better for the people that live there. We wanted to open up the homes so that the people that had escaped the war were able to come back to a safe and secure environment without fear of recourse. And I thought we did a pretty decent job of that. With Iraq, I was naive to believe that our move into Iraq, that we would have done the same thing, that we would have created a safe and secure environment. And what did we do? We just bombed the shit out of them, destroying any type of an infrastructure that they have. We didn't allow for people to move back in and continued to, my brother was a Marine. He was part of the Fallujah invasion in Iraq. And he told me how they would drive around. And if you happen to be in eyeshot of what they believed was an enemy, they would throw you in the back of the truck. So they were taking civilians, makeshift prisons where they would interrogate the shit out of everybody. And they didn't know, because they didn't know if they were going to get the bad guy or not. So they're just like, well, let's just arrest everybody. No due process whatsoever.
Right.
And then a lot of those guys, if they had any affiliation or any chance that they could be a terrorist, they shipped them off to Guantanamo. No due process. They never had people sat in Guantanamo for months or even years before they're like, you know what? You're good to go. It's like, you have destroyed this person's life.
Yeah.
You rip them out of their family's arms. And I ask Americans all the time, I'm like, if a foreign entity came into the United States because of what we were doing, the way we were treating the families at the borders, and let's say another foreign country made the decision that the way we were treating these people was a human rights violation, and they intervened, Americans would go ballistic.
They'd be howling at the moon. They'd be howling at the moon. Absolutely.
Oh my God. Can you imagine a foreign entity stepping, even if it was an ally, let's say the Carabinieri, let's say Italians,
yeah,
who spend as much time working on their facial hair as they do at work all day.
Yeah.
So let's face it, we watched a bunch of Italian troops come in here and just start arresting Americans that were potentially involved in human rights violations, like those Minutemen that are down and walking the borderline in Arizona.
Yeah.
How mental do you have to be to voluntarily get in uniform and carry an assault rifle and walk the border of the United States and Mexico? How bankrupt is your life?
Yeah, 100% agree. 100% agree.
Americans would go ballistic if they watched Italians do that, and yet we expect other countries to open up the doors to the United States because we reign democracy and prosperity everywhere we step foot.
Which, and the opposite's true.
And no one everywhere.
Yeah, and that's said no one anywhere. The opposite is true, and that's the thing is like you make that point about what would happen. I mean, I say that all the time. If the Italians or the Germans or if the Russians had a base here in the States, we'd lose our fucking mind. Right, but yet we got 1,400 bases all over the world. We're in like 80% of the countries in the world. We have like 2 million troops all over the world, and we got 200,000 fucking American troops right now stationed outside on the west coast of the Chinese, on the west border of the Chinese. I'm like, why? And no one pays attention to this stuff. And it's like when you said earlier, we subscribe to this nationalism. It's like nationalism is the simplest form of thinking. You don't have to think. And it's like the most contrived fucking thing. Like, does anybody give a fuck that football players are not standing for the flag? No. It's just you don't want to admit that we got a race problem in this country, and you want to turn a straw man or take something that's valid and make it into a straw man argument, make it about the fucking flag and the national anthem. And since when did football have to become about the military? I go to jazz shows and stuff. I don't see that. We're not flying planes overhead. We're not saluting the flag. Guy comes out, he plays his music. Since when does the...
And we all know...
Okay.
And that patriot says that sense of nationalism was designed. I mean, you and I both. I mean,
yes.
It's not even a secret that the U.S. government pays the NFL, which is a nonprofit. I was invited over to a friend's house, and of course, I get a little hostile. I watch football games. I'm not going to be 100%, hypocrite.
I like football.
Yeah,
I watch it every Sunday. I watch it every Sunday. I'm a dick. But continue.
No, and I don't damn you. I don't damn NFL fans at all if they enjoy watching it. I'm just not that good of a. I want to play. I'm not a very good spectator.
Right.
I don't want to watch other people having fun.
Right.
But I'll watch it. And so, but I mentioned, we were talking about the NFL, and they were talking about this new. I think a rookie, somebody that was brought in, and they were offered a $25 million 2-year contract. And, this guy in the room was immediately like, oh my God, how do you roll something like that? And I said, even more disturbing than that. I said, do you realize the NFL is a nonprofit? And they had no idea. So if you were to poll NFL fans and ask them if they knew that the NFL is a nonprofit, most would probably even oppose you. They'd be like, no, it's not.
Right.
It's like, yes, it absolutely is.
Right.
And they get subsidized by their respective states.
Yeah.
They use taxpayer money to build stadiums.
Right.
Yet, look at how much money those players are making. Obscene. How much are the owners of the companies making?
Right.
Obscene amounts of money.
Yeah. 100%.
And people got all mad about Nike. They're like, well, Nike is supporting Colin Kaepernick. And I said, well, Nike is also the largest clothing maker for NFL products. It is their number one customer is the NFL.
Right.
I was like, so what? They can, like you say again, what I say in public is of little consequence for what I do on paper.
Right. No, you're right.
So if Nike's feeding the machine, yet I could be like, well, I oppose what, police violence do.
Yeah, but see, but then Nike's also, but Nike along with Adidas and everybody else, and I'm not 100% of a purist. I still buy Nike, I still buy Adidas, but it's like, shit, it's sweatshops. I mean, you got if you're for the environment and you're eating meat and you're driving a car, you got to make your deals with the devil. Because that's exactly what's going on. And so, I mean, these things are made in sweatshops, and we don't have jobs in America anymore. And I would gladly pay twice the amount of money for a pair of Nikes if they were made in the States, to be honest. It wouldn't bother me. My shoes last forever. I take care of my shit. So it's like I walk in my shoes. I don't change the oil. So it's like I don't get why people have to sit there and make things about nationalism. When we, for example, with the NFL, we know that the National Guard, Department of Defense, has paid the NFL in the last 9 years now, 10 years, and this was under Obama, by the way. Genius move on Obama's part because he knew he was going to take Bush's 2 wars and turn them into 8, and so he was wanting to create more sympathy for the troops. And so those parades that we see, those flyovers and the big flag and all that stuff, that's been paid for by the military. Like $17 million has been given to the NFL for those displays. So when people sit there,
it's unreal.
Yeah, and when people sit there and go, well, here's a picture of Walter Payton in the 80s and he's out. Yeah, it used to be an option. You could stay in the locker room or you could be out front for the national anthem. That was Payton's decision. But if you look at the picture real close, he's not surrounded by a bunch of his players. Him and 3 guys. And when it became a mandatory thing that you had to be out there, that was 2009 under Obama. And so now when Kaepernick decides to take a knee, everyone loses their mind and makes a straw man argument, even though he's flat out said, him and Eric Reed flat out said, no, this isn't about the troops, this isn't about anything, this is about police brutality. And then they flip it to him, oh, well, you're a pampered athlete, you're a spoiled rich athlete. When were you ever persecuted for being black? Well, that's not the point, is it? When was Trump ever fucking persecuted for being a working class white guy who lost his fucking job in Scranton, Pennsylvania? Never. But idiots listen to this game show host, dickhead celebrity, and don't ask a single question because he's speaking the language of nationalism. which is basically it's almost always a precursor to genocide because now if 9/11 happened now, there wouldn't be any bouquets of flowers at the mosque. Trust me. We took it from hating Islamic terrorists and extremists to now we hate all Arabs. I just did a show that's coming out on Monday with a guy named Miko Peled, and he wrote an incredible book on the Holy Land Five. And these five Palestinian guys who happen to be Palestinian Muslim ran the biggest Muslim nonprofit in the United States. I think one of the top 3 in the world. And they were dotting their I's, crossing their T's. These guys got railroaded by the Bush administration. I'm talking nervous fucking sentences, like 65 years, right? And it's an insane book. It's called Injustice. You got to read this book. It's a quick read given the volume of stuff he had to go through, but he really puts it together really well. But all that to say that
who wrote it?
A guy named Miko Peled, Mikopeled. He's an Israeli who won't call himself an Israeli, but he's an Israeli pro-Palestinian activist. Guy about my age, and he's a genius. He wrote a book called The General's Son. He's been on my show twice, and just fucking genius guy. This guy's just brilliant, and just he's been at this for so long. He can pop off any objection, to what people would hurl at him, because his point is that he doesn't think Israel should be pushed into the sea, but they are an apartheid state. And if they're going to act like a true democracy, then they have to embrace all of the population that they have and give the Palestinians a right to return, because they did violate the 1947 UN petition by invading the rest of what was Palestine, because it was supposed to be a have-y thing, and taking it and making it Israel in 1948. And so he gets into the narrative and the falsehoods that we've been pitched all these years. It's insane. And he gets into the Ethiopian Jews and the Iraqi Jews and the Iranian Jews. The guy's a genius. He's all over the internet. I mean, like I've been stoked to have him on my show and actually call him an acquaintance, if not at least a decent friend. I know him decently, but man, cool fucking guy, man. And he knows his stuff. You'd get a kick out of him. But all that to say that we get into this nationalism, to your point, and it's just a shortcut to thinking, because if you're just told, this is what you do, Saddam Hussein is a Hitler of the desert. Okay, well, he was our ally 2 months ago. Yeah, well, we go, and then we're doing the same thing with Venezuela now. We're saber rattling in Venezuela, and you notice how all these countries, the thing they have in common is that they don't play ball with America. Venezuela hasn't played ball with American oil for years, and we don't like that. Right?
No, absolutely. And, and it's a sad, state of affairs. I want to, before we may start talking about Venezuela, is that I've seen that so much with when you talk about the rise of nationalism, and and it's a completely different topic. But when we look at the the lack of significance behind our educational system in the United States, that we have burrowed everybody into levels of ignorance and not only levels of ignorance, but taken away their critical thinking skills to the point, I would say over the last 40 years, because of, you look like wage stagnation. When I tell people that there is, that wages and inflation were supposed to be parallel, and that yet we've had wage stagnation for well over 40 years, and I can show people charts, and they just don't believe it. I'm like, well, why is it that, CEO A is just got, $25 million this year, and not, one of his employees is making over 100.
Right.
And so I try, and it's just amazing to me is that when we try to educate people, like you said, how come yesterday's freedom fighters, today's terrorists? It's because who's telling the story, and nobody's willing to look at the long term. I learned that when I went to Korea. I stepped foot in Korea, ignorant as shit, back in 1996. It was December of 95 when I landed in Korea at the ripe old age of 19, completely ignorant of the Korean War. And the first question I said is, why am I here? Why is the United States in Korea? And I started doing my research. And, and as you go back and you find out the Chinese involvement and the U.S. bombing campaign on North Korea, which leads up to now, where just like, the media, before we talk about Venezuela, the same thing that they talk about North Korea, about how it's the evil empire and they're going to overthrow the United States. I was like, with what?
Right.
What honest power does North Korea have to overthrow anything? Like, I may be concerned about Guam as far as an immediate threat, but I had not one. They even made a movie, the redo of Red Dawn, showed how North Korea invades and takes over the western side of the United States. I was like, are you kidding me? The most powerful, most highly financed military on the planet gets beat by North Korea.
Right.
It's something as simple as they turned off the lights. Whatever. Come on.
See, but people see that
shit.
But
what does that do?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, yeah.
No, that's what they do to plant the seed in the ignorant masses,
right,
that could possibly happen.
Right.
Well, that could happen with a zombie apocalypse movie. We could be overrun by zombies. That's a possibility.
Yes,
I'm not discounting it.
It's a probability, absolutely. Yeah, I would go there. I mean, but see, but that's the point though, is that when you talk to these, for example, I forgot that the Apprentice TV show was even on, right? And then when people would get, and I've been following Trump for like 30 years, and not super intimately, but I've known who he was for 30 years, just a supremely punchable douchebag. And I've known about the bankruptcies. I've known about a lot of things because the news would cover it in real time. And people just don't watch that shit. They just don't. And now they're just starting to, because they kind of got woke, unquote, which is getting kind of annoying because they're just like a bunch of little kids. But people would sit there during the 2016 campaign. Oh, I want a businessman running this country. Okay, the guy's declared bankruptcy 6 times. Well, no, he's a successful businessman. And then it dawned on me. I was listening to NPR one morning, and these 2 producers were kind of doing a mea culpa. They're like, oh, yeah, it's our fault. We kind of, the hotels kind of were shabby. And, so we created this other thing and had to get a set. We couldn't shoot it at the hotel because the hotel's such a piece of shit. So, all those big red leather chairs you see on that show were like just a set. And so they created this myth of the big bad businessman, but he was making more money on The Apprentice than he had made in years. And it didn't hit me till about end of the summer of 16, when I was going, where do you guys get this information that he's this businessman? And then somebody mentioned the TV show. And I was like, So when you talk about the Red Dawn thing, people sit there, well, it could happen. Gotta be careful, because like we can have Sharia law before you know it. All these Muslims coming here. It'll be just like Germany. Yeah, Germany is loaded with Sharia law, right? France is completely taken over by Sharia law. The fuck kind of fantasy island shit are you getting from Fox News? I mean, this is the kind of thing that drives me bananas, man.
They do. And it's, and when I talk to people and they're like, well, what about they said I had, in a conversation with people that you would think are otherwise, the lights are on, they're standing up, they're walking around.
Right.
You would wonder how they made it through 40 or 50 years of life. And this guy was, saying to me, well, the Nation of Islam is building terrorist training camps all over the United States. And I said, where? I said, you name one place where the Nation of Islam is building a training camp for Islamic. I said, listen, if you don't think your government doesn't know every nook and cranny of what's going on in the United States, you're sick in the head.
We're the most
we have, like you, I think you were just going to say it. With the government, going back to Hoover's days, turned the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA inward. They're more looking at us than they are anybody else.
We're the most watched state in the history of the world. That's a fact. More than the Stasi in East Germany. We're the most watched state in the history of the world.
And yet, secret Islamic training camps are popping up all over the United States to overthrow us and introduce Sharia law into our very own legal system. Our legal system's fucked by itself.
Right.
We have such disproportionate rights as far as everybody's civil rights and civil liberties. You and I, we beat this drum. You only get as much rights as you can afford.
That's right. Absolutely.
It's so disproportionate in this country. And people are afraid of Sharia law. I'm like, I'm afraid of our own law.
Fuck, we got a two-tier justice system in this country. Are you kidding? HSBC got a deferred prosecution, which, by the way, Jeff Sessions had up until December of last year to actually prosecute HSBC because under Eric Holder and Lanny Brewer, they got a deferred prosecution agreement for all the money laundering they were doing for the drug cartels and everything else. And so they got a 5-year deferred prosecution agreement, which meant the Justice Department had 5 years to decide if they're going to bring a case against HSBC. And Jeff Sessions, who's not Eric Holder and not now spacing on the last Attorney General's name, but the woman, the other lady, he's not them. He's not a Democrat. And in December of 2017, he decided to not pursue any further legal action against HSBC. He dismissed them on their deferred prosecution case. So meanwhile, some kid is sitting in Rikers for a couple of years without being charged, waiting for an indictment of some kind by being busted with 2 joints in his backpack.
No, absolutely. And you know me, I'm in Colorado, avid supporter of the federal legalization of cannabis. I think that what it could do, not only for our economy, what it could do to build a sustainable future, and so on and so forth. It's amazing that in the same country that I live, people can still go to prison for having a couple of joints.
100%.
But these bankers, these sick assholes that robbed, Americans of billions of dollars. I remember back, one of the ones that come to mind, you think of like Wells Fargo. After they were the only bank back during the housing collapse in 2008, when all the big banks collapsed, Wells Fargo was the only bank to remain solvent following the collapse. Our bailout worked for every other financial institution under the sun. However, their banking, the fraud that they perpetuated on the American consumer, predating that, all the fraudulent
credit cards, yeah.
What am I thinking? The credit cards, the fraudulent housing loans. Yep. They were giving loans. If you had a pulse, you didn't even have to have a pulse. They were granting loans to dead people. And it kept going on. And even today, there's not a month goes by that Wells Fargo is not under investigation for some fraudulent practice. They're on this massive PR campaign.
Yeah.
Reestablished all the time.
Reestablished in 2018.
Yeah, we want to gain your trust back. We understand that we might have broke your trust a little bit. We're going to do what we can to win that back. And I'm like, you fucking stole billions of dollars from U.S. taxpayers.
Yeah.
You continue to now steal their identities. You're now involved in identity theft. God knows what you're involved in as far as international human rights violations. And the government's just they're going to throw some kid in jail for fucking joints.
Well, hey man, listen, we got a few minutes here in a little bit, and I wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit about Venezuela and kind of see what the Ghost of Christmas Future has to say about that, because I honestly think that by next summer we may be invading Venezuela. What are your thoughts on that? Is that something we should be really worried about, or is it just we're going to keep trying to usurp their government and doing the same horse shit that we've been doing in Central and South America for the last 70 years?
Well, if it's not unknown that the propaganda machine is in full force against Venezuela, not to state that there is not a massive humanitarian crisis in there, but where the U.S. government is talking right now is that the solution to this crisis is a U.S. invasion. That's kind of what they're talking about. Is that the only way to help Venezuela is for us to invade their country. And with South America, for decades, really popularized by the Contras affair in the 80s, is that we've been fucking with Venezuela.
Right.
And, and you look at now being fueled by the current administrations and, Republican representatives like Marco Rubio.
Right.
That are are trying to gain U.S. support in this type of a campaign. And it's an easier sell because you can, it's easy for me to call a socialist a communist.
Right.
It's very easy for me to sell Americans, because we saw this against Bernie Sanders during his campaign, is that he identified himself as a democratic socialist.
Right.
Well, it's very easy once you hear the word socialist to be like, in which Venezuela is a socialist state. So it's very easy for me to say, oh, well, they're communists. They've got a dictative, regime. Their people are suffering. And so the only way that we're going to win democracy in Venezuela is by military intervention.
See, but the thing that's frustrating about that is that, the Chinese are capitalist dictatorship. They are flat out capitalist as capitalist can be. They have a communist party at best, which operates like a democratic socialist platform, kind of like, no, really, they operate no different than most European countries, except for the fact that they are a dictatorship, and they have a lifetime president. But they are a capitalist dictatorship, and people always like to say, "Hey, see how much freedom now they have because they're capitalists." No, they have capitalism, but they don't have a whole lot. They don't have that much more freedom. I mean, they've got freedoms. But you could still be put in jail if you don't approve an eminent domain deal. If you won't sell your property to
Absolutely.
If you won't sell your property to Taipei LLC, they can put you in jail till you decide to sign the agreement. There's a bunch of shit that they do still. So, and to sit there and say, well, the Venezuelans, it's a socialist country that doesn't work. That's a straw man argument. Let's just say Colombia is a capitalist country that's failed, because without us, they're awful. Why don't they look at something that's like that works like anything in the European models? But that was, I wanted to ask you about that as we're kind of nearing the end here, because I don't see why Americans are so gung ho about another fucking unwinnable war. We go into Venezuela, we will get our asses kicked. This isn't Grenada. This isn't Panama with a population of Austin, Texas. This is a large sized country with people that like living there. Oh, and by the way, Nicolas Maduro, he was democratically elected. Hugo Chavez, democratically elected. So again, to your point, if some country invaded our country to arrest our guys for human rights violations down at the border, we'd howl at the moon.
Absolutely. And I think with this campaign, what we see is this trend where the old people in Washington go back to their playbooks and they said, what worked for us in the past? And you have to remember back to, El Salvador and Nicaragua, in the early 80s, yep, during the bombing campaign there. Yep. And people have now got to a point, the millennials, hell, even myself, Gen X, people that were not old enough to remember the fraud perpetuated upon the American people through the support of the Contras in South America. They're like, well, let's go back and play that record again. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Why? Because I go back to the same companies I recognize: Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing. If they don't make bombs, we don't buy bombs. And if we don't, we don't buy bombs if we're not dropping bombs.
That's right. 100%.
So but who am I supporting? I'm supporting Raytheon stockholders, because I've got some rich fuck sitting in a gated community in fucking Maryland who, I don't want him to have to cancel his golf club membership because he lost his stock in Raytheon. That as sick as it sounds, that's what it comes down.
Well, I'll tell you, we're going to go ahead and end it on that cheery note. The show's called The Bitter Truth and Not Big White Kids.
Hey, by the way, it's my birthday Sunday.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday. You and your lovely,
Thank you, bro.
You and your lovely lady, I'm sure will have a splendid time celebrating. Folks, my guest has been Chris Ward. Ward of the World is his website. I'm gonna have that in the as a link in the body of the description of the show. Again, you can visit patreon.com/The Bitter Truth. You can always listen for free, but you can also be a bitter pill, help support the show, and get some fresh bumper stickers. Yay! And guys, as always, if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.